Hello, hello. So happy to be here.
Thank you very much.
No, I thank you for taking the trouble. Thank you.
Thank you very much for allowing us into your beautiful home. Do you have a favorite part here in your house?
Well, having grown up as a student, I got used to living in one room. So I have my desk in my bedroom, and so that I basically spend most of my time when I'm in the house. I was
Yourself.
in there for 72 days
In your room?
in the room.
What were you doing inside the room?
Driving myself crazy, basically. Well, when you're ill, you don't really mind the passage of time. So
You're talking about the time when you got COVID.
yeah, when I got COVID. So if you're not feeling bad, you don't really worry about it. I knew I was better because I was getting very bored and just think, when can I get out of here? When can I get out of here?
Do you have a morning routine po? Sir
Well,
Bong?
yeah.
Like what time do you usually wake up?
I'm usually up by 7, but after cleaning my teeth, go straight to the computer and look messages and answer my mail and see what's happening, what I missed from the night before.
So
wanted
hindi
to-
kayo nagbe-breakfast, Sir Bong?
I fast
Is that the intermittent
in
fasting?
the intermittent fasting. Yeah, it
Oh.
seems to work for me. Sometimes I forget that I fasted and I haven't eaten, and I'll go and exercise.
What's your exercise?
Uh, Gym. Because my schedule's so crazy, I can't do it like before. So that's what I do now. Uh, just to have to stay fit, especially after COVID. It's my father's influence. My father was, before the term was invented, he was a health freak. And he would exercise at least an hour a day, sometimes twice a day.
So you would see him exercise when you were
He would
regularly?
he would bring us to the gym. He said, "Come," when we were little.
Since you talked about your father, when you were born, he was already in politics.
Yes, yes. He became congressman in 47, and then senator in 57.
That's the time you were born.
That's the year I was born. Yeah. Actually, I think he was always in politics, at least in his mind. When I became governor of Ilocos Norte, I got to talk. Since I was spending all my time there, I got to talk to some of his friends and the people who were around him when he was still living in Ilocos. And they said, 16 years old pa lang yan, may kabinete na yan.
Really?
Oo. Talagang my father is one of those, I suppose, the most single-minded person I've ever known. If it had nothing to do with his work, he just wouldn't spend time on it.
Saan po kayo pinanganak?
San Juan? No, pinanganak ako dun. So we lived in our house, which is still there, until 1965, when he won the presidency and we moved na to the palace.
He won his presidency in 1965. You were 7 years
Yeah,
old.
because I remember my first birthday in the palace was my 8th birthday.
What was that like?
Oh, it's amazing because my dad brought me pa to school. He woke me up. He came into my and he said, "Come, it's your birthday. I'll bring you." So he brought me, and I cannot forget, and my classmates cannot forget. There were those two yung ice cream. Nagbebenta ng sorbetes, Magnolia, hindi, Selecta pa nun. Hindi ba?
Yes.
So, dalawa sila. So my dad made it Pacquiao. He said, we paid them some money, and he said, lahat ng hihingi ng ice cream, libre at habong araw kasi birthday ng anak ko. So I was the most popular guy.
Anong school po kayo pumapasok
Lasal
nun?
Green Hills. In Ortigas, yeah.
So at 8 years old, you already lived in the palace. What was that like, growing up in Malacanang, in the palace?
Well, in the early days, Masaya kasi ang daming
Kaya, ang daming rooms, ang
ang
laki.
daming pupuntahan, ang daming mong, you go down to the kitchen, you mess around with the cooks, and then you go to the CQ, you mess around with them, you play with them, you go to the park. So there's many places to go.
Anong favorite place niyo nun sa Malacanang?
I used to end up hanging out with the CQ all the time. I guess with the guys, you know. The Palos was so interesting. But as the time went on, the private part of the palace became smaller and smaller, and the office part of the palace became bigger and bigger. There was at one time that I came out in my pajamas, and my father was approaching with a state visitor. So I said, okay, not happening again. You do not leave your room until you're
Fully dressed.
completely you're ready to see people.
How was your relationship with your father?
With my
Nung
dad?
time na yun? Was he a disciplinarian?
Everything was study hard. Yun lang talaga. Basta work hard, study hard. That was his main thing. As long as you're studying hard, you're okay with him.
You got a lot of his traits. Diba? You grew up watching him sa stage, giving speeches. So, marami sa rhythms niya. Even yung size niya, nakuha niyo.
Yeah,
Yung
ang
waist.
katawan namin is remarkably similar. From shoe size to waist, everything. That's why I was one of the lucky ones that when binibigyan siya ng regalo, no, I would raid his closet. My mannerisms, especially speaking, is very much my dad's. But syempre, from the time I was very small, we were already there in the back watching him make speeches. And he would teach a little bit about modulation and everything, but voice modulation and things like that. But mostly, what he would insist upon when we started having to speak was that learn it, don't read. The thing that's also that everybody says is my voice. Is that we have the same voice.
Di ba po when your dad was a president, sinasama niya kayo sa lahat ng kanyang mga visits in different parts of the world, and you have met some of the most powerful and influential people. You have even met the royal family.
Yes. Some of the funnest parts would be my mom would call and says, "I'm going to meet Generalissimo Franco in Spain. You want to come?" Of course, get out of school, number one, di ba? And we'd go, I'm going to see the Pope. Sama kami. I think it was a conscious effort of my parents to expose us. Because even the travel, like they would go to the provinces, or they would go to, especially yung mga Bagyo, yung mga ganon. Sinasama lagi kami. We were always there. So I think it was my parents that they really wanted us to see everything.
Sino po yung na-meet nyo that made a huge impact in your life na hindi nyo makakalimutan?
Madami masyado. I've met most of the popes. I've met most of the secretary generals of the UN. In fact, I've met them all since youthant. Si Indira Gandhi was one who really impressed me, and Maggie Thatcher.
What do you think is the greatest lesson that you have learned from your father?
Oh my, I learned so much from him. It's hard to. When it comes to work, marami siyang, like things like when you walk into a room, the guy, if you're walking to a negotiation, whoever knows more wins. So I've always held that. Always work hard. Hard work is always rewarded. Things like that. He was not the type to sit you down and say, ano mo, anak, ang ganito, ganyan. Hindi, basta say, ito yung gagawin natin. He would be with his cabinet members, some, and they would be talking about something pretty important, and he would suddenly turn to me, "What do you think?" Like, you
Ilang
know,
taong kayo?
I was 16, 17. He was already turning to me and said, "What do you think?" But you know, when he asks you a question, it's not because he wants to know the answer. He wants to know if you know the answer. He's testing you. Kasi nung inaaral na niya yan, alam na niya yan. So, I'm prepared.
From your mother naman po.
From my mother, well, of course, it's the certain things. My love of music, of the arts, because our house always had music playing. She was the one who used to take us to the theater, take us to museums. It really was her point of joy, really, was were the arts. It wasn't normal. You didn't have there wasn't such a thing as a normal day. Every day was different. What formed the way I do things is how my father or my mother would react. It's having watched both of them handling the problems that they were confronted with on a daily basis. I think that's what really made my own personality when it came to such things. I would say that the many incidents that I watched them handle really taught me how to approach problems, how to take the challenges that inevitably come up.
Speaking of yung handling life situations and problems when people were marching towards EDSA,
How did your father handle that situation?
My father called me and he said, "We have intelligence that these people are moving and this is what they're going to do. I'm assigning you to work with the security to handle the defense of the palace." So that's from that day on, that's all I was doing. From that point, that Wednesday afternoon, naka-uniforme na ako eh. Because I just come out of the military also at that time. Kaya ako linagay. Sabi niya, ikaw ang in charge sa defense ng palasyo.
how was your father nung time po na yun?
So he reverted back to his commander mode, wartime commander mode. Again, very calm, very measured.
So nung nangyayari po yung rally sa EDSA, ano yung sinabi niya sa inyo?
I remember saying, yung kalaban, sabi, ginigera na tayo. And he answered me. He said, "I have spent my whole life defending Filipinos. I cannot hurt them now." That was it. Baba, put your guns down. Say, we're not shooting anyone.
Were you scared nung time na yun?
No, I wasn't. I can't say as I was. Because militarily, we had an advantage. It's just he chose not to fight. And then they took us to Clark. When we got to Clark, dinisarmahan kami, lilipad na kami sa Guam. Which is what happened.
How was your father when you were in Guam?
He was ill. He wasn't well. He wasn't sleeping. But again, he was still his old self. He was in that mode. He was in commander mode.
Was there ever a time that he showed his vulnerability to you?
He's a professional, so basta kung anong kailangan gawin natin. He didn't shirk away from any kind of challenge. Basta kung ano hinaharap niya talaga. Basta the opposite of vulnerable.
Solution-based.
Oh, absolutely. Mission-oriented yung tawag sa military. Mission-oriented.
How was your last moments with your father?
Before he passed away.
They called us. I was in San Francisco. And the doctor started calling, and actually it's my sister said, "You better come back." So I rushed to the first plane back to Hawaii. And that's it. And he had a kind of a seizure. His heart failed. And we were just watching him, trying to revive him. But yeah, he didn't make it. And I remember I was hugging Irene, and we were looking because we were asked to leave the room while the doctors attended to him. So we were watching him through the window.
What was his last words with you na tumatak sa inyo talaga before he passed away?
I remember just before he died, he opened his eyes and he just looked at me. And you're gonna make me cry. He just looked at me, and he closed his eyes again, and all the alarms went off. All the machines started beeping, and then all the nurses came in, all the doctors came in. We were hustled out of the room, and that was it. So there were no last words, but
There was that last look.
there was that last look that I will never forget. And God, look what you're doing to me. People will think I'm a crybaby.
It meant the world, that last look.
It's a very, very sad memory. And sad and happy at the same time, because at least meron siyang last na connection with me, with us. I could see he really looked, and he knew who I was, and he knew that perhaps she was going.
Parang
So,
that look was a farewell.
parang ganun.
A lot of people were saying that your father, Ferdinand Marcos, was the best president the Philippines has ever had. And to some people, he was the worst president the
Sure.
Philippines has ever had. But if I were to ask you, what's the best and worst thing about him?
The best thing about him, as a leader, as a president, he was an actual leader. I think the problem now we have is that we lack leadership. You cannot be president following surveys, which is a tendency that we have not only not only here but in other countries as well. Meron siyang vision talaga. I want the Philippines to be this place in 10 years. I will make the Philippines this good by that year. Meron siyang vision. Yung galing ng Pinoy, yun doon tayo. Pagandahin natin, tulad niya. He had a very clear understanding of what needed to be done and how to do it. And that, I think, was his best quality as a leader, which was born of his experience, born of his smarts, born of his love for the Filipinos and Philippines. The worst, I don't know how you would describe, because he had all the qualities of a good leader that a good leader would have, should have rather. He took any job that he had very, very, very serious. A very serious person. And that sense of focus, maybe that's the worst, because everything was put aside. If it does not help the presidency, it does not help the country, if it is not in the national interest, you keep it to yourself, because I don't have time for that. That's all I have to do. Not to say that he was a negligent father, but he was always very doting with us. But that was his life. That was everything that he was about. Worst in the sense, kasi kami, mga anak na, I wish we could spend more time with him. And so, ano ba? It's never, we never see him anymore. Actually, my mom did the same thing. They were always out doing something, even when we'd come home from when we were going to school abroad already. Pag uwi namin, so umuwi pa tayo, we don't naman see our parents. But that was the kulang part in our, because they were just so busy. There was just so much to do and so many things to...
How do you handle po, Sir Bong, yung mga criticisms, yung mga bashers, yung mga hate? The anti-Marcos.
Well, we're in political life. Find me a person in political life who has no critic, who has no hater, who has no bashers, who has no critic. And you can't find one. Nobody won an election with 100% of the vote. No one, ever, anywhere, unless they cheated. So that's something that we learned to live with because I remember very well when he was Senate President. I remember being in Baguio for some reason, and every day the newspaper would be, oust Marcos, oust Marcos. Basta binabanatan siya ng gusto. I'm talking young. I was quite young.
Ilang taon po kayo nun?
I must have been 5, 6 years old.
So at 6 pa lang.
Pabasa na ako eh. You could read already. So,
And you would get affected nung time na yun, syempre.
hindi ko maintindihan, ba't galit sila sa daddy ko? Ba't galit na galit sila? Eh, siyempre, babasahin ko yung diary, hindi ko naman naintindihan kung ano yung pinag-uusapan nila. So, I remember asking an aunt, saying, ba't ganun? Ba't sila galit kay daddy? Bait naman si daddy. Hindi, ganyan talaga.
And to this day, Sir Bong,
kaya nga,
the mere surname, merong mga talagang pag narinig, Marcos. But your father po, how did he handle that? Yung mga Aus, Marcos, yung mga credit?
Trabaho lang, tatay ko. Trabaho lang. That's nothing. I mean, I've been called worse names. I've been called every name in the book. Tawa siya na tawa. If you're making your enemies angry, you're doing a good job. And we go back to Churchill. If you haven't made any enemies, you haven't done anything. Ganyan talaga. Ang buhay ng politika eh. Wala ka talaga. Hindi mo maiwasan yan eh. Kahit yung pinaka-popular. Tignan mo. Our president now, if you look at the surveys, ang taas-taas ng popularity, ng approval rating at lahat, meron pa rin galit sa kanya, meron pang minumura siya, meron pang kung ano-ano sinasabi. Hindi mo mawala yan eh. And we learned that lesson I did anyway, I learned that lesson very early on.
At the age of 6.
Mga ganun. I remember, we'll look in the history books. When was the time when he was Senate President, ang gusto talaga siyang tanggalin. They just kept attacking him and attacking him. I remembered, I still in my head, I can still see the newspaper. Oust Marcos, Marcos, out. Yung ganun, puro ganun yung headline.
At the age of 6, ano? Parang ang aga-agad na awakening yun and realization about life. Di ba?
It had to happen because buhay talaga namin yun. It's been that way since
history.
Before we were born.
Yes.
Di ba?
Speaking of history, Sir Bong, if you were to change one thing about the Philippine history, what would you change?
The colonizations, sana hindi na tayo na-colonize. I would do away with the Spanish colonization, the 300 years. And all the Americans essentially colonized us too. And I think that Filipinos deserve better than to be second-class citizens.
Your mom has been very vocal about you following the footsteps of your father, hindi ba? So, where do you see yourself next year?
As long as I'm functioning, I consider myself to be in public service. I hew close to my father's idea that it seems we were put on this earth to serve, and so that's what I'll do. If that is my purpose in life, and that's what God wants for me to do, then that's what I will continue to do. Hanggat I'm functioning, it's never finished kasi. It's never finished. There's always one other thing that you can do. There's always a little bit more that you can do.
So if it's not yet finished, what is it po that you want to continue doing?
Helping, just make the Philippines better. Well, right now, to be specific, is we're in the middle of this crisis. We have to improve our vaccination rollout para talagang, because it seems to be the only solution. In the very beginning of the pandemic, I was trying to find a way that you could balance opening the economy and staying safe. With the vaccines coming, what really needs to be done now is to have a plan for the re-emerging Philippine economy. What do we do? Paano natin bubuhayin ulit yung mga nalugi?
In the eyes of public, you have lived a privileged life. And parang iniisip nila, you seem to have everything. If there's one thing that you think that you don't have, ano po yun?
I agree with that public perception. Well, in the earlier part of my life, the privileges we enjoyed, we grew up in comfort. We had never needed for anything. What is it that's kulang pa in my...
You think that you don't have because you seem to have everything.
I'm jealous of you. I wanted to be a musician.
Sabi nga po ng anak nyo, if you weren't in politics, rockstar nga daw po kayo.
Ay, yun. Dalawa lang ang ambisyon ko nung maliit. When I was about 12 years old, maging rockstar, maging astronaut.
Sino idol niyong rockstar nun?
Stones. With Jagger. Well, the Beatles. All of them. The Who. I became friends with all of them eventually. Nakilala ko silang lahat. Siyempre, all this,
If you were to introduce the name Marcos to the new generation, how would you introduce yourself to them?
Well, I'm the son of the longest lasting president who brought the Philippines into the modern world, really. And we became who brought to the Philippines a sense of nationhood. I've been asked many times, what's the most important part of your father's legacy? I'd say the most important part is that sense of nationhood. When we were proud to be Filipino, when we would go out abroad and say, Filipino kami. I think that was the first thing. And not a small part of that was OPM, was the original Pinoy music. Because it's the culture. You learn about, this is what it means to be a Pinoy. This is what it means to be Filipino. And that happened during his time. And if you ask me, despite all of the successes that he had, built all the roads, the schools, the educational system, the medical, that's all wonderful and something that we should continue to. It's that sense of nationhood. And we were united. We were united as one. We were all working in the same direction, And we've lost that a little bit. And that's what I would like to, that's how I would introduce myself. I would like to restore that. Nasa ugali naman ng Pilipino na matulungin eh. Nasa ugali natin yung bayanihan. Kailangan gisingin lang ulit eh. Kailangan magtulungan ulit tayo. Medyo nakikita natin during the pandemic, random acts of kindness.
Bayanihan.
And just because Pinoys are just great. I mean, Pinoys are the best. They're the kindest, most gracious, most masipag, most resourceful. And you never give up. You know? Pag masyado nang mahira, gagawa ng joke. Saan ko naman nakakita ng gano'n? Hirap na nagpapatawa pa.
Very resilient.
Tough. We're tough. We're tough, not in that arrogant or aggressive way. We're tough in a very gentle Asian way, which is for me